Before we get started with this episode, I have a few requests. Download the Talk Music Talk app. It is free for iPhone and Android, wherever you get your apps, or you can subscribe on iTunes or Google Play. Once you do, just leave a rating and or review in the store to help spread the word about the podcast. Second, share this episode on social media if you enjoy it. Facebook, Twitter, however you like to do it. It will help spread the word about the podcast. And finally, I am in the process of acquiring advertisers and sponsors, and I need your help. Just take a quick survey on my website at talkmusictalk.com/survey. Should take you 30 seconds or less, and it would be greatly appreciated. And now for today's show. Hello there, my friend. Welcome to another episode of Talk Music Talk with Boice. I am Boice, and this is my podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Talk Music Talk is a weekly music interview podcast where I have long-form conversations with people who are connected to music from different genres and different backgrounds. Music therapists, music journalists, singers, songwriters, musicians, the up-and-coming, the well-known. And this week, I am releasing 2 episodes back-to-back, 107 and 108. Why? Because it is my birthday week. Depending on when you are listening, the actual date is November 30th. I'm releasing 2 companion episodes back-to-back for my birthday and the second anniversary of Talk Music Talk. That's right, my birthday and the second anniversary of Talk Music Talk. The theme, LCD Sound System. Why? Because they're a great band. Episode 107 was with music journalist Ryan Leese, who wrote an entire book on the Sound of Silver album by LCD. In this episode, the one you are currently listening to, 108, with Gavin Russom. Gavin plays synths and builds instruments for LCD, and he makes his own great music. He is originally from Providence, Rhode Island, from a musical family. Started out on the cello. We talk about his whole life, all of it, the importance of music in his life, growing up feeling like an outsider and discovering punk music and culture and how that made him feel less alone. We also talked about the meaning and the importance of art in his life. Plus, we discussed his music projects. Black Meteoric Star is one of them. New project coming out soonish. And we also talked about working with James Murphy and LCD Sound System, how that happened, the music, the farewell, the reunion. And after the conversation, you will hear a Black Meteoric Star album. Well, actually, you're going to hear a song from the new album. Shelled Landscape is the song. A live performance of it from a DJ set of Gavin's on Devil's Night of 2016 in Dresden, Germany on a night called Thriller is from the forthcoming BMS album. The album is entitled Second Coming, A Black Meteoric Star. Great track, great album. Had a chance to hear it. I'm enjoying it quite much. Just listened to it right before I recorded this to get me in the mood. But here it is, without further ado, my conversation with Gavin Russom. Enjoy. Mutual friend, Zachary, Alan Starkey, spoke highly of you.
Well, I appreciate that. I speak highly of him as well.
Okay. How'd you two connect?
Well, his hair, I think.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. I will not. So I think he was somebody that was sort of like, would often comment in like an intelligent and like, aware way on like things that I would post on social networks. So I sort of was like, oh, it's interesting. And then once he came to an event that I was part of, and I was like, you're Zachary Allen Starkey.
Yeah.
Because I recognize your hair. And so we became friends. Sort of. We had a lot in common. So
okay.
We just kind of became friends. And then before City Club, there was a party. Like City Club is a party that a collective of us do. Zachary's part of it, Lauren Flax and Katie Rex. So before that, Lauren and I did this party called Dracar Noir at Boston Nova Civic Club. And Zachary would come to that party a lot. Okay. So we sort of got to know each other and hung out a lot between sets there.
Okay. And then you collaborated musically.
Then he was working on some new music, and I think he wanted to have it really not take a totally different direction, but production-wise, he wanted it to sound different than the stuff that he'd done previously.
Okay.
And he asked me to mix a track for him and sort of do some production on a track for him, which I did. And and then he's gone on to make some more music, I think, continue to find like his own sound and move forward on that. Yeah.
Is that a different space for you to mix as opposed to remixing?
It is a bit. I think particularly during the initial tour that I did with LCD Sound System in 2010 and 11, I was remixing a lot during that time because being on the road, I wanted to stay in a sort of creative groove. Okay. But it was, I would be gone for 8 weeks and then home for 4 days. And like, it was I found it at that time, like a bit difficult to like actually compose. I was also working on the Crystal Arc album and I was sort of doing that on the road. And to sort of just keep in line, to keep going production wise, I was doing a lot of remixes. And that got me interested in like working on other people's music. Yeah. I thought, well, this is kind of cool. Like remixing isn't exactly like producing, but I think the way that I ended up approaching it is maybe a bit more like, okay, if somebody like I would sort of think of the remix like this, like I listen to the track and think, okay, what if somebody brought this as a demo to me and they said like, this is what we're working on, but we want to kind of like, we want you to like reshape this sound of our band. So that's how I would approach remixes and like do a lot of new production. Basically I would kind of have some rules for myself, like never change the tempo and always keep the vocal. Okay. And otherwise, sometimes I'd produce a completely new track. So that got me interested in the idea of like, of producing, like, and I did, I just did a couple things, none of which ended up sort of like, developing into anything. There were a couple different people that asked me like, oh, hey, would you like work on this track? And I did that. At the end of the day, I did it to help Zachary out and because we had a sort of a connection, and he worked in my studio a lot because I was on tour. So he worked in my studio on the music, and so I it's like very acclimated to my ear because it was on a lot of my own equipment. But in the end, I think I decided, and who knows, things are always subject to change, but I felt like that's actually not where my interest lies. Okay.
Just being a remixer.
Yeah, or just like producing other people's music. Like it's, I could see there might be some situations where it'd be interesting, but in the last, I would say like 3 to 4 years after the release of the Crystal Arc album, I really, as the sort of like a creative life kind of goes in waves, I really experienced this wave of like, after a long period of doing a lot of collaborations, being like, I want to deepen the center a bit again, go back into like really solo productions, really get back into composing. And that's where my interest sort of lies right now.
So is it hard you mentioned about trying to work on your own stuff on the road. Is it just the groove of being in the road that makes it, you have to keep your mind on
I'm like
that?
a machine guy. So I think that's the major part, is that I don't produce with a laptop. Okay. And like the idea of dragging a bunch of synthesizers and drum machines on tour is daunting, to say the least. I have had experiences like a lot of the Crystal Arc album. I sketched things out on a laptop in hotel rooms, and I would just kind of like get sounds that were okay. Yeah. And do arrangements and think about, composition and work things out. And then those 4 days that I'd be back home, I'd go back in and like re-record everything, like using machines. That's the major problem to me. I actually get very inspired on the road. That, travel is inspiring to me. Like these sort of like whatever, like long bus rides, looking out the window, like being in airports. A lot of that just sort of like liminal time is really inspiring to me. I like being in hotel rooms and like all of that stuff is really inspiring. What tends to happen to me more is I sort of go out on the road and like gather a bunch of data and then come home and work on stuff like, but yeah, it's a weird rhythm. It's just, being on tour is its own animal. And it's kind of addictive. Yeah. I think I'm kind of hooked on it in a weird way. Like I love it, and it's also strange.
Yeah, because usually you hear people they don't like it, or that's why they stop. What is it you love about it?
Well, I think I love music, so I really enjoy. Certain things like when you play with the same people and you play like every night or 4 days out of the week, there are things that happen musically that like they couldn't happen any other way. You can't think your way into them. They're not intellectual. There's nothing that you could figure out. But as you just play with those people night after night after night, like it starts to be almost psychic in a way, in terms of like intuitive moments that might happen between songs and rhythm. Rhythm just becomes this incredibly detailed thing, as you play the same, like the same or similar music over and over again. Just rhythm takes on this tremendous life of its own.
By rhythm, you mean with the groove?
Yeah, well, I think...
or metaphysical rhythm.
Well, I think it comes down to sort of like minute details about the groove. Like where each note or percussion thing sits in a tiny grid of like, everything's on before you leave. Like you know the songs. But as you play them over and over again, there are these nuances of like, that's right where it is.
Okay.
Like that's where it is. And like it's, that one note in that one line is it's a little bit ahead. And so like as you play, my thing, particularly like on a tour where it's like, where we have a set and we're going to play these songs, is like, how can I be better every time?
Okay.
Like that's how I keep from getting bored, essentially. Of like, oh, we're going to play the same set again. Like it's the opposite for me. Just like, how can I, and better for me just means like more of what it is. Like, how can I make this sound like more of what I really think it is? How do I play this line like what is it? Like, what is this line trying to say? Where's the meaning in it? And how can I get closer to that? Okay. Like, I just try it every night. And it's not a linear thing. Yeah. Like, sometimes I'm like, whoa. Like, I have an off day, And then sometimes it's like, wow, this is like so nuanced the way it locked in and stuff. And,
when did you find that out for yourself?
I think it happened for me really intuitively when I started playing in bands when I was like a teenager, that I just like, I liked practicing. Like I was, and like so when I was a kid, there were sort of two things that happened parallel.
Okay.
Like in my family is very musical, going back like generations. There are some professional musicians, maybe just one, some music teachers, but mostly people for whom just like playing an instrument was just like really important part of their life. A lot of religious, people for whom that's like a religious thing. And so I was like really interested in sound when I was a kid, and I got a little tape recorder like for a very early birthday. Yeah. And so I just became like fascinated with recording and sound. And at the same time, because like music was really important in my family, like, and because I'm old and I still like, I went to public school at a time when like there were music lessons in public school, that was phased out so early on, but like maybe first, second, third, fourth grade, like we had an orchestra and a band in our public school.
Same here.
And it was crazy.
Drum major.
Yeah. And so I had, that was a class. Music lessons was a class, and I took the cello. That was my instrument. I wanted to play the upright bass because I think like I grew up with a lot of jazz. My dad's a big jazz head, and so I think like I thought that was cool, but I was like very small. Like, I mean, I was a kid, but I was always a small kid, and so they were like, I don't know if they make an upright bass so you can play. But cello's kind of like that.
Maybe later.
Yeah, exactly. That was a scam though, because like later it didn't happen. So I played the cello, and that like practicing that, I have to say I was like, I have a lot of like classical musicians in my family and friends, and like I love theoretically that thing of the practice, like of practicing every day. Jazz too, any like really, I guess maybe more like disciplined musicianship. I just love it in theory. Like I think it's so cool, but I just could never get to that point of like, oh, I'm going to practice 2 hours today.
It was
always just like, I mean, I wish I'd known about like Arthur Russell and stuff when I was like a kid, because then I would have been like, oh, well, there's something cool about it. But it always felt and honestly, it felt very tied to like a culture that wasn't part of my experience at all, like classical music. It's like, it was part of my experience in that it was like a family value, and like it was held up as like, this is what art is.
But personally,
I was like, I was hearing a lot of other music that I thought was very cool, and like that didn't fit into it, so it always felt so. But I think when I was playing in punk bands and stuff, I just found that, oh wow, like I love that we this week we got together 3 days a week and we prepared for that show, and that show was better, and then like and then the next show was better than that, and I just sort of became intuitive, and then. Like right after I graduated from high school, I'm not even sure what happened, but for some reason, I think it was like 1992, which is like a very odd moment for music. Like hip hop and dance music were just exploding, and just like this incredible amount of like new sounds, but like it was like I grew up in Providence, which is kind of small. So I did experience this very cool thing of like hanging out in a scene of people who were just like interested in music, meant that I had friends who were like into hip hop. I had friends who were into acid house, and I had friends who were into punk, and that was all just mixed together. Like it was just like sort of like the people who like listened to like mainstream radio, and then like the rest of us who were like some goth kids, some like, and a lot of those people like. They may have dressed like a punk goth kid, but they were like hearing, Detroit techno and acid house, and all those things were very mixed, because there wasn't enough, there weren't enough people into any particular, like New York, it's the opposit. Like there's a bunch of people into every little nuanced micro scene.
You can find them.
So, it was like I was getting exposed to a lot of music, and that moment, I think, there was a cultural moment of like punk going kind of mainstream. I mean, there's even like the Sonic Youth movie that's called like 1991 or 1992. I can't remember what year, like the year punk broke. And so I was just kind of like, I don't know, like I was like, I really like the energy of like punk and hardcore, and I like playing that, but I thought this is like not what it was when I got into it, and that was changed. And I was like, I'm also really loving these new electronic sounds. So basically me and a few other people, after I graduated from high school, we started a band, and it was like this sort of cool moment in my life where it was like, we're going to start a band, and we don't know like what kind of music we make. And I was like, well, how are we going to do that? And we thought, well, we'll like improvise. Like we'll just get together in my basement and we'll play.
And what are you playing at this point?
At that point, I was playing bass and I was singing. And very quickly, I think sort of like leading up to that, I had started to discover like feedback and stuff like that. And I started to get interested in noise, and like I started to understand that the bass could be played as like a very extended instrument. That like, while I could certainly play, like, I had some musicianship in terms of playing bass lines, that I got more interested in just using it as this way to like generate these like very low subsonic tones by having it feedback. So that's a lot of what I was doing. And then we had, my cousin was playing keyboards, and he was playing an M1, which at that time was like, it was a very contemporary sound. It was like a very dance music sound. I think there were certainly not a lot of like punk or like post-hardcore bands that had like an M1. It was very, and then there was a guitar player who was doing similar stuff to me in terms of like washes of drones and noise, and a drummer. And so we would just get together a few times a week, and we would improvise. and it's a pretty amazing experience for me. It sort of set the template of like my musical aesthetic in a lot of ways. And what I noticed with that was that it was one thing to sort of like know some songs and rehearse them, but that in that situation, this other thing started to happen as we would practice more and more and play together more and more, that we would start to tune into each other, in odd ways, where like without looking each other or any signal, like we, 3 of the 4 of us would like make a change at the same time. We would know when things ended,
which is very jazz.
Very jazz. Yeah, very jazz. I mean, I think, I'm a jazz fan.
Yeah.
I like jazz a lot. I listen to jazz a fair amount. But I also think that the fact that I was hearing jazz in my house from birth, it's not even on a thought level. It's just very deeply in there as an aesthetic, and particularly like, sort of like the jazz of like probably, I don't know, sort of like if you trace a line from like Django Reinhardt through like the Coltrane record right before Love Supreme. I don't know what that is. Like right before Coltrane just like goes fully like. Was
that like your dad?
That's like my dad's aesthetic. Like that's his block.
Very specific.
Yeah. So like Charlie Parker, Lester Young, Bill Evans, like Miles Davis. Just that stuff was just playing a lot. And also blues as well, which obviously has a big improvisational element.
So hearing all that, how did you get to the punk?
Well, I think because I had crushes on punk girls. Probably, to be completely honest, that's probably the
Your
first
gateway.
That's probably the first one.
I think I might like that.
That's what I want. I think too, like I was like a teenager with like emotional issues, and I also, there was a thing too. There were 2 things about punk. One that was like it felt, even though it actually was like, so I started getting into punk in probably 1986 or 87. So it was already actually something that was slightly from the past.
So is it punk that was out then, or sort of
older stuff? Punk? Yeah, more like 70s, early 80s, but I think my feeling was like, oh, this is contemporary. Like this is music that's like happening now and reflects contemporary situations. It's music that like speaks to me on some level, but also I think it was, this feeling of knowing about something or having a musical identity that felt separate from like what everybody else was doing. Like that to have been a kid. I was kind of a depressed kid. I was kind of like a outsider kid in a lot of ways. I grew up in a neighborhood that was like basically situated between like a very, very poor neighborhood and a very, very wealthy neighborhood. So I also, and it was actually a very interesting place to grow up because like it was extremely diverse in a lot of different ways in terms of like religions that people had and like ethnic backgrounds and race. And I can't remember why that came. I can't remember what the train was that went there.
I was
punk.
going to bring you back.
Yeah,
okay.
Punk.
And we're back.
Yeah, exactly. And it like fairly early on, I felt like, partly my parents are kind of like politically radical and they're too old to be hippies, but like proto hippies. But there was that thing of like sort of like looking out and being like, I think everybody's full of shit. Yeah. Like, I think this is like, things are messed up. And like if you're just walking around acting like everything's fine, there's got to be something wrong with you.
Yeah.
And punk felt like not just punk the music, but the people that I knew that were into punk music, it felt like they were talking about real things.
Okay.
They're talking about real things, real problems. And also it was like, it felt like, I mean, and this is a word that took on a different meaning, but it felt like a legitimate alternative. Like it felt like there's sort of like everybody else is lying to themselves and sleepwalking through their life. And over here, there's a group of people that seem to be thinking about things, talking about things, and also just establishing themselves as counter to that.
Okay.
Like, I mean, culture is very different now. Like I think right, that it's very different now. But at that time, that just had there was this very authentic sense in the mid '80s. Like it's Reagan, you know, there's like mainstream culture and counterculture. Okay. And that just felt like that was so clear. And I was like, I want to go over here. Yeah. And, you know, like also like, I think, you know, I was totally aware of hip hop, and like, I was aware of, you know, sort of like electronic dance music coming out of the Midwest and stuff. And I had friends for whom that was their sort of like core musical, the way they identified in a core musical way. I mean, and for me, I think also like I was white, and like it was very clear to me that those musics, like, although I had access to them and like could go to those events, that like I was a guest. Okay. I was a guest in those houses, you know, and punk felt in a lot of ways like, and I was happy to be a guest in those houses, and I felt welcomed as a guest in those houses, but like punk felt like
more your tribe.
Yeah, in a sense. Yeah. And a related one, you know, like I think one of the like most cool memories of my childhood was that like, you know, I think by the time I started to get really seriously into punk, I was going into high school, and in my high school, like my public high school, there were these paintings from, I guess, the early 80s, these huge mural paintings in this sort of like weird underground hallway that went between the cafeteria and another part of the school. And they were like, I can't remember, it was like a few album covers, but one of them was The Message.
Okay.
And I'd never seen that. Like I knew the song, but I'd just like heard it on the radio or on tapes. I'd never seen the record cover. And I just remember like walking down the hall and seeing it, and they're all wearing like studded belts and stuff, and being like, all right, like this, you know, like, like it's all connected. Yeah. And so and you know, it just like it felt alive in this way. And then later, I think hardcore became even more like that. Like whereas punk, I thought like it felt like while this feels contemporary, most of my references are from the late 70s and early 80s. I was like, hardcore is happening right now, and every Sunday I can go to a matinee at a club, and these are bands, you know, that don't even have records out, you know, or like that just felt like this absolutely living thing.
So is it the culture for you also? Is it the lyrics of the punk music? Or
I think it was like a mix of things. And I think it was also like sonics, like really like frequencies, and like there's this really, I don't know if you ever saw the Ramones movie.
The documentary.
Like this thing that blew my mind is like how Jerry Ramone talks about how like listening to the Stooges was like a soothing experience for his OCD because it was so fuzzy and like big muff distortion. It's so fascinating, you know, because it's like a really interesting idea about like frequencies and like how. Yeah, although you may have this thing of like relating to the lyrics or whatever, there can be this thing that's happening on a whole other level. And I think for me, it was like frequency and volume was like a big part of it. Okay. And also, but the culture too, and I think particularly like while I liked listening to music at home, the experience of going to like a show was just unbelievable. It was like there's all these people, they're all dressed up, like they seem super interesting. I'm talking to them, you know, and we all like this music. And I think particularly the thing like that I think is a real difference between the going out experience then and the going out experience now is that there was so much downtime. Like there was this time between bands playing or even in places where like it was more of a DJ dance thing. There were like areas where you could go where you weren't just like bombarded with sound. Okay. And so there was also like not just the music, but all the things that surrounded it of like conversations you might have with people or over here or like, oh, there's those people are sitting over there. Like, what are they doing? So yeah, I think it was the culture and all aspects of it, like the sound, the visual, the politics of it too, you know.
Is this leading you out of feeling less outsider or comforting?
Well, I don't know. I think like, yeah, certainly. Like, I think I certainly had like a sense of recognition of like, oh, like this, yeah, I just had a sense of recognition. I was like, and to some degree, like this music is articulating something that's inside me that I share with these other people. But I would say like, as I got older and started to, I guess, just less like glean my identity from the music that I listen to. I mean, I think it's a normal thing. I mean, like when you're younger, it's just like it becomes your identity. Like, oh, this is what I'm into. I'm into this. Like music stayed really important to me, but it was less of like a identity creating device and more of a sort of just like craft or a practice. So that sort of like, yeah, I mean, branching off from that kind of like 1992 moment, I started to feel very alienated from, you know, like from culture, because I thought, now I'm starting to lose track. Like now when I see people who seem to exhibit a visual style that I can relate to, I talk to them and actually we're not having those kind of conversations. So I don't know what's going on. You know, it's like, and to a sense, that's like, yeah, like that's now, you know, that's like, that's the long arc. It's just of being sort of like.
This is a hot topic thing or?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Totally. Yeah.
Or more poser.
Yeah. Just like, I think that one thing that started to grow in terms of like the way that like music gets marketed and just like capitalism in general is that, you know, different types of styles became like these consumer choices. So it's like, oh, like what, you know, what consumer choice do you want to make? Like you want to have like is alternative your style, you know? Whereas at a certain point, like alternative was actually something that had a meaning, believe it or not, as you know. I mean, we're probably similar age, but you know, that alternative actually, the term alternative actually described something that was a legitimate alternative, rather than just like, it's a style of music or it's a fashion choice. So yeah, I mean, I think like also I went to art school around that time. I think I went to the Art Institute of Chicago for a year. So I guess I went from, like school year started in 92, ended in 93.
What'd you go for?
What's that? I went for painting.
Okay.
And that was an intense experience because I think I had an idea of what art school would be like, which I thought was sort of like some combination of like craft circle and like revolutionary political think tank. And
was it?
It wasn't, it wasn't at all. And, and when I looked out on the first day of school at the auditorium full of people, I would have thought, oh, here it is. Like these are the people with whom I'm going to have these like deep, connections and with whom I'm going to share an approach. And like, I was like, this is like, as mainstream as anything else. And that was a big disappointment in my life, and that's confusing to be like, and also, I don't know if it was naivety or also growing up in a sort of small place, or that times changed, but it was like, I can't interpret these visual signs the way I used to be able to. I can't read these signs the way I used to be able to, where I used to think, I'm sitting in my high school class, first day of school, and I look over and there's a girl with like dyed red hair and she's wearing like a blazer over a t-shirt and like some chains, and like I'm like, we're gonna be and we were, like I
inside matches the outside.
Yeah, exactly. Like I at some point got the courage to talk to this girl and we became friends, and like we had a lot in common, whereas like exactly, like even a couple years later, 4 years later, I guess, in art school, it was like a very different thing where like those signs could no longer like be relied upon to.
Did you realize was that like the first day on campus?
Kinda.
Really? So what do you do? It's like
I dropped out. I would. Yeah. In retrospect, I would say that's like probably that was probably a situation that I didn't navigate as well as I could have. There was certainly lots of really interesting stuff available. I mean, and some of which I learned about later, that actually like in Chicago at that time, lots of very interesting stuff happening. Lots of bands that I still really like now were around then. And of course, like, like the sort of like very interesting, like later wave of sort of like acid and house was happening. There's tons of great stuff happening. You know, my sort of stank attitude mostly hurt me and prevented me from experiencing a lot of those things.
So you like walking campus, like head down.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I was depressed. Smoke pot. Like, you know.
Oh my God,
you know. Yeah, and was unhappy, and eventually, you know, I just dropped out because it was not working.
Yeah.
You know,
Why?
Life took me in another direction.
Yeah. Why painting as opposed to music?
Well, so I, to be honest, didn't really know you could like beyond like developing musicianship as a classical or jazz musician. I honestly didn't know that you could like study music.
Okay.
I just wasn't aware that existed. And so, yeah, I went to public school up until 10th grade. I finished 10th grade in public school. And then I had this opportunity where I got to go to this arts school, arts high school. And, you know, in a sense, that was like, I mean, not that I was in a particular, you know, like I wouldn't have said that I was like an at-risk youth, but it was definitely good for me to get out of Providence. Okay. Like, and that was kind of my way out, that I got to go to this school. And I mean, I was very ambivalent about that because there was a part of me that liked like hanging out with like dangerous people and being in the Providence scene. But, you know, it was a way that I got out, and I got to, and I studied painting there. Okay. So it was sort of a thing where I was like, I was, you know, not doing well in school, and I was having some problems, and this opportunity presented itself, and because an older cousin of mine had gone to this high school for music, and I thought, well, if I can like, I mean, it's a funny thing, but like I thought, if I can kind of pull this together and create a portfolio that's good enough to get into the school, then, you know, it was like two parts of me were arguing, but that part was like, I have a chance of like, you know, like not getting stuck in this thing, which could have potentially, you know, it might have just not been that good for me.
Is that the fear when you live in between, you know, very rich area and very poor, that you're going to be stuck?
I think but I mean, it feels like a Rhode Island thing in a lot of ways, that like, just like, it's like a, you know, like it's like not, you know, a lot of people just stay there. Yeah. And which is, it's a great place, you know, it's just like, I don't know why, maybe it's because like, I mean, my family's not like from there. Like my parents just moved there because my dad got a job there. I always had this feeling like I can't stay there, you know, like there's like a fountain there that everybody says, like, if you ever drink from that fountain, you'll never leave. And like, I remember my friends like throwing the water on me and me like running away, like, you know, for whatever reason, I just had that thing of like, I gotta get out of here. And also, I think in the, like, I mean, in that period of sort of like the late 80s or early 90s, it was also really dangerous. It was really dangerous. And I think partly because of the area that I lived in, there was a lot of like, there's a lot of robberies, there was a lot of violence, there was just like, it felt very unsafe. Yeah. Like it probably would have been more safe in a lower income area. It was because there was like, you know, like it was just it's almost like it was like the beginnings of like the kind of gentrification that we see here. You know, it's like suddenly there's, you know, middle class people sort of stuck onto a traditionally low income neighborhood, and like definitely problematic in lots of ways. And I think, I like also hung out with I started, you know, at some point, like, you know, started to hang out with really dangerous people, and like I like that, but also like there was some part of me that was like, let's get out of here. Yeah. And for me, you know, becoming a visual artist, although I always was interested in visual art, was kind of like this thing of like, okay, I have this opportunity, let me focus and try to make a portfolio, and then my life can change, and I can have this different life. And so, I mean, really, I just started like drawing and painting to get this portfolio together for the school. It was always something that I did a little bit, but it was like suddenly I did it.
You had this purpose, goal now.
I had a goal. And then I was there, you know, I was there, and I just, like, I didn't want to play the cello. I didn't want to go there for music. Like I said, I mean, I just didn't know you could, I mean, I don't think I could have gone there for like electronic music, but like the idea that you could like study electronic music or sound, like I just no idea. And so painting was this way for me. And so I studied painting there for 2 years, and I really, enjoyed it. I've been a visual artist at various times, and I do visual art. I mean, right now I sort of focus more on music, but it's always a part of my life, and I like, I'm really interested in places where those things meet and interface with each other. And studying painting was cool because it was like a different idea about composition.
Okay.
Before I even had the word composition, painting was a way of arranging things, like creating meaning by arranging things. And, I got really interested in like abstract painting and that stuff. So it was in a sense, it's like a logical next step. Like I knew that I was going to go to college, because, like my dad's a college professor. It was just like sort of a thing.
Yeah.
And I was interested in painting. So
why not?
it was like a logical next step. Yeah. And then that was the thing that happened. I got to the Art Institute, and it was like suddenly like, film and video and sound, sound art. It's the first time I saw a modular synthesizer was there. They had an EMU system, which I didn't even stick around long enough to take whatever class it was you had to take to get to play with it. I did go in there one time with this other guy and just was like, this is so incredible. But they had it set up and you could see it through this window. And like just seeing it, I was like, that's what, that makes sense to me. But it was just, also like a tremendously overwhelming experience to be like, oh my God, there's all these things you can do. I had no idea. I think, my approach to the arts was very based on like very traditional ideas about art, I think, because of like the way that it was important to my family. It was like, like modern painting. There was just like these like things that are legitimized. And then there were these things that I just didn't know about. It was like modern painting, classical music, jazz, anything up to like 1961 and mostly from Europe, like anything beyond that is just, I just didn't know about it. I had no idea. And so my mind was actually blown. I mean, I think it's part of why I also was not able to get that much out of the experience is because like to be torn by this thing of like, oh, I came here to just paint. Yeah. Like I thought I had to like eke out these ideas I had about like improvising and connecting visual art and music and like the margins, like on my own time in punk clubs or whatever. And like now there's a whole school where I could do this and I'm already there. It's just like, it seems weird, but it was like, it just, turned in on it.
Like you know what you know. But those 2 years there, you know the expression, wherever you go, there you are, right? How much of Providence and it's still there in you?
A lot, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a lot. It feels like even like more now. I mean, I think it was only a few years ago that I stopped just being like, I gotta get out, like there was, and I love it there. And, I've always like maintained a connection to there. I mean, my family doesn't live there anymore. They live nearby, but like, I went back there a lot. I mean, also because I was doing things like dropping out of school and, met new people there, like met new people who were into music there and played music with them and sort of stayed connected to the music scene there, which is like super cool music scene. And, I feel like there's a lot of that, like I think Providence, like any place sort of has a sensibility. And although I moved out in 1990, so it's been quite a while since I lived there. I really feel like it's a big part of, even just simple things like when I was growing up there, I mean, it was like Providence was a really huge mercantile center in like the 19th century. Okay, it produced costume jewelry and like fat textiles. It was a place that was really booming with factories and shipping and then those whoever were the owners of those businesses realized that it's much cheaper to do that stuff overseas. And then all of that stuff was gone. And so by the time I was born there in 1974, it was just like, there was nothing happening. Yeah. Like, I mean, I didn't by the time I was like looking for jobs and stuff, that had changed a little bit. It did change a bit, but like, it was a very economically depressed place and it was very empty. It was the most thing that was like really a lot of just like empty space and, abandoned houses and like empty factory buildings and railroad tracks and just like, just like small town America stuff, for from that time. I think there's like tons of little cities all over America that have the exact same story. But just that visual aesthetic, like I still dream about that stuff, you know, and that experience of like, I mean, it's why I was attracted to moving to Berlin like 12 years ago. You know, that experience of just sort of like open space that's still in a city and stuff. Just like, it's in there so deep, you know, that I think it's like, comes out, you know, in my music, it comes out in the things that I do.
So you do your time at the 2 years with the school, then you transfer to Bard?
Then I went to Bard. Yeah.
Okay.
I took some time off and I moved back to Providence for a little while. And then I went to Bard.
How was Bard?
It was good.
Okay. Was that better for you?
Maybe. I was a different person.
Okay.
And the thing about Bard was that, I mean, what attracted me to Bard was that there was this guy, Benjamin Boritz, who was teaching composition there. And I mean, that's where I knew the word composition from visual art in terms of like how you arrange objects in a painting. Okay. But, you know, that's from him that I really got the word composition for what I do with music.
Because now you're immersed in music. You're going from music.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I don't know what shifted in there. I mean, I guess that was that thing of being exposed to like this idea, like, oh, you can make sound art, you know, like you can make electronic music, and then being like, oh, well, that I could go to school for that.
Yeah,
like, I want to do that. And also the program that he was running was very like, you know, it was totally mixing visual art and music and poetry, and it was really attractive to me, like the way that he described what he was doing, which was a lot of essentially like what he would call like starting from scratch, of like sort of trying to compose based on not necessarily intuitive, but like internal musical imperatives rather than like externally imposed structures. And
that means what? Listening
a lot, like doing like tons of like active listening, doing like tons of like listening without like making the best effort to like listen without any judgment or evaluation. So just taking things in and then like unpacking them and writing. A lot of like, you know, I mean, essentially improvising, but we would usually call it like free composing or whatever. A lot of playing and a lot of listening, like listening back to tapes of playing, listening to pieces of music, talking about music a lot, writing a ton. And, you know, it was challenging and strange, and I felt like I was in a cult in a lot of ways because it was also sort of set off from the college proper in a lot of ways. But man, I mean, for any flaws it might have had, like, his approach really worked for me. And in this very strange way where, like, for example, those things I was talking about earlier about rhythm. Yeah. Like, it was like he was, like, shortcutting us to the real thing, you know? Like, bypassing all the theory and the scales and the, you know, and, like, just shortcutting us to, like, just, like, the fundaments of music making in this way where it's, like, I don't even know I never experienced a sort of like intellectual understanding of anything that was happening. But I just know that, like, you know, now, I mean, I graduated from Bard in 96, like, you know, now, what is that, 30 years? That's so crazy. Is that 30 years or 20 years? 20 years. 20 years later, like, I'm able to do things compositionally that just, like, still astound me, where I'm just like, it's like somebody just, like, opened up my head and put some stuff in it and then closed it back up. Yeah. Without me knowing, like, you know, it's a weird thing, you know, it's almost more like of like an initiation experience than it is of an education experience. So
it's almost he's like teaching you how to be intuitive.
Yeah.
To trust that.
Yeah. And to really be intimate with music and understand music and be able to sort of like work with music on a very, very deep level. Okay. Like music is something that is like intrinsic to not just human beings, but like the world in general. Okay. And that, that structure, like in a sense that structure is this creative act. It's like a creative act. It's also a political act in that you are taking your time and making it mean what you want it to mean rather than having somebody else.
Okay.
So there was just this these very, very deep ideas about structure that I feel like got transmitted to me through ways that were very non-intellectual. I don't know how he did that, but something happened.
Magic.
You know? Yeah, so like very much felt like that. You know, it's like I went in with like some interests, and then I came out with some skills.
Okay,
but like, or skills is a weird word, but just like, I don't know.
Yeah,
it's very strange. Not a normal college experience, I don't think, but like,
was that leading you? Were you thinking going to a professional musician or teaching? Or?
It's the lack of aspiration that I had as like a college graduate is pretty astounding when I reflect on it. Like, I think I was so immersed in the process that I really had no thought of like what I would be doing afterwards. I had no idea. I mean, I moved to New York because, eventually I had the music courses, but I started doing some work in the art department too, because I had enough of an interest in visual art that it needed sort of its own space.
Okay.
And there was a professor in the art department who would just kind of like, I didn't even have any classes with her, but she would just like come to my studio and hang out and like give me feedback and we would talk. And she was just like, "What are you going to do after you graduate?" And I was like, I don't know. And she was like, "Listen, my friend's subletting her apartment in New York. I think you should take it." And then, like the rest is history in a way. But I think my aspiration was that I would get some kind of a job. Like, I was interested, like, these are the jobs that I thought I would do when I moved to New York. Repair the dioramas at the Museum of Natural History. Okay. That was like probably number one. Do windows for stores. I thought I thought I would get a job that had some creative element to it.
And more visual.
Maybe. Yeah. And that, or anything, like, I was like, like,
whatever.
I applied to like Mystic Fire and like sit there and dub videotapes all day. Like, I thought I would get a job and I would pursue my creativity on my own and hopefully find some space for it, like some forum for it. So that was my thought. Like, I will get a job to make money, and then I guess it like carried, they carried the already ingrained idea that like you're never going to make any money off this, which like isn't true actually, but like that's I think a cultural thing, a societal thing that like
the starving artist,
could just never, like that has no value, which is ridiculous because it does. So I thought I'd get some kind of a job, and then I would just like I'd find some way to share my creativity, either by making records maybe or like doing concerts. And I think a lot of like the sort of like more institutional frameworks for presenting work, like particularly like more maybe kind of like established like new music venues or art galleries, felt like very unapproachable to me. Like nightclubs felt approachable. And sort of like alternative spaces. I mean, at that time in New York, there still are. New York is very cool. New York is very astounding. It's amazing. There can like, even though it's so like been so corporate invaded, like there's still there's much stuff. There's still lots of alternative spaces and people throwing warehouse parties. And
when does it? I'm sorry. When does it click for you? Like after you graduate, that you can actually have a living. That took a while. I think I knew people that originally it was like I knew people, and it wasn't necessarily that they were making a living from their art, but they were not having jobs. Okay.
I think those were the first people I got inspired
by. Which is
big. Like, I think, some of them were like squatters, and, like some of them were people who lived in Providence and just like had figured out how to pay very little rent, like sell some screen prints, like, and that was, I was like, how are these people pulling this off? Like, how do they not have a job? And I really had, like, I had no idea. I was like, really was one of those things where I'm like, how is he doing that? So that was the first thing. And then also had a really good friend who he became a really successful artist. And I mean, mainly what happened was there was this guy, Daniel Reich, who had like a gallery in Chelsea in his apartment. And he like my friend Christian Halstead, had connected with him. And like, you know, they were two people who were, you know, Chris was making art in his apartment. Daniel had a gallery in his apartment. It was very, in a way, underground. But Daniel was really brilliant in a way and was able to sort of like parlay that sensibility to the bigger art world.
Okay.
Which for me had just seemed like inaccessible. Like I remember somebody asking me if I was going to get a gallery when I moved to New York, and I was like, "What? I don't even understand what you're talking about." And I worked for galleries, you know, like I often would get hired by galleries to like make some curtains or like, you know, help install a show. Yeah. But just like I was like, get a gallery? Like I just didn't know that meant. And then like it was wild, you know, like I just watched Chris do it, and I was like, "Oh my God, that's really inspiring! Like you can do that." And for him, it was more visual art, although I think he has a very like musical sensibility in ways, and like we've made music together in Black Leotard Front, and we did a lot of collaborations together. But yeah, I think that was a big moment that I was like, I know this guy. Like I know this is somebody I know. I just watched him do it.
Okay, and it's real. It's real if you know somebody.
Yeah. And yeah, it was one of those things where I was like, maybe I can do that. And so, I mean, even before that, I think I'd been working at a restaurant in East Village, and it's hard. It's hard, like waitering stuff. Yeah. It's hard. It's like the obvious choice in a lot of ways, but it's hard. And I reached a point where I just kind of couldn't do it anymore, and so I just left. And I sort of just like, you know, decided I saved up enough money that I thought could last me like a year.
Oh, okay.
And
that's good
was
plan,
like,
dude. Most people don't do that.
Rent was cheaper back then.
But then the first time, I'm going to save up for a year.
Yeah, I mean, and I didn't come with it on my own. You know, I had somebody, you know, other people suggested that to me.
Yeah.
Like, and
you got tired of balancing plates on your arm.
Yeah, totally.
How far off is this from your like recorded music?
Well, at this time, I mean, that's what's interesting. So, like, from when I started moving to New York, I mean, the thing that happened for me was like this. I was just like, this is so weird. I have I have this like weird composition degree and like this experience that I'd say would probably prepare me to maybe like go to grad school, you know, like, or maybe maybe I could start doing some roulette or something, you know. But I was like, I didn't want to do that. I was like, I'm way more interested in what's happening in clubs. I'm like, how do I do that?
Okay.
So I was constantly recording music at this time. And actually it's like this Paper Eyes Cognitive Source Drive record that came out earlier this year is like a compilation of a lot of that music from those first years when I moved to New York, when I was working in a restaurant and, I mean, probably like delivering food at that point. This was very early on. And, and like recording at home.
Okay.
And, you know, I was like, I would love to make a record, but I didn't know anybody. I feel like I didn't have access to that. So I would make like tapes. I would just dub, you know, 5 to 10 tapes and like take them to other music and be like, will you guys sell these? Like, you don't have to give me any money, you know, or like,
you just want to
get it out there. Yeah. And like to somehow connect or something. And, so I was always doing that. And then I had this interest in synthesizers, and that was just sort of there. It was always around. And when I took that year off, I thought, okay, well, I'm going to do this now. I'm going to I'm going to start building synthesizers.
Okay.
Because it was something I always wanted to do. And I was like, well, I'm taking a year off work. You know, I'm going to do this.
Did you have like a role model for that, or someone you saw?
Well,
do
what
that?
mostly happened was like, so I had mentioned like my cousin grew up like a block away from me, and we were the same age. He's like a month older than me. But I don't know, you know, it's just like, I don't know why, but he sort of started to put together like a little bit of an electronic music studio, like even in like the 80s, like, and we had another friend who had a little bit of a more elaborate music studio, and like, you know, like, had like a couple keyboards, and then, you know, it was like, I think, you know, at the time it was like, it's kind of that odd thing. It's like, actually, I guess, you know, like digital synths had sort of taken over, but it was still, you know, it was around. But anyway, my cousin's dad was a computer programmer. And at some point, you know, like my cousin was like, oh, I want to get another synthesizer for my studio. I want to get like one of these ones with like the knobs on it. And I didn't actually know about this until much later, but his dad was like, oh, well, I've heard you can build those. Like I've heard those are simple, so let's do that. Like, let's do a project where we build it. And that actually never ended up happening, but it was always this thing. And me and him would start to talk about it. I'm like, oh man, it would be so cool if we could just like even build a simple little thing. We could just do a performance, you know, it'd be great. Just like with 2 knobs, you know, just be so cool to just like can make something that makes sound. So in a sense, he was sort of my role model. And at some point he gave me a book. He gave me the book that his dad had bought him when they had this idea that they were going to build a synth together. And I started to go through it. And I thought, oh, I don't know. You know, and I just started like slowly like teaching myself. And at that time there were like these news groups, like where you just like, basically it's like a mass email list. And there was a synth DIY one, which I got on. And there's like a lot of like all the people that now are even like the grandpas, like Paul Schreiber, Dieter Dipfer, Tom Gamble, you know, a lot of these people that sort of were like the very first wave of the revival were all on there, you know, and I'd just be like asking them questions, like, how do you read a schematic? You know, and they, you know, like, and like all those guys helped me a lot. And so that was also helpful. And then when I started working again, one of the jobs I got was working with this guy, Jeff Blenkinsop, who's sort of like, he was like, you know, he worked with like Hawkwind and like Vangelis and Pink Floyd and stuff. It was like a big deal. Synth tech guy. He did the Voyetra. He did the voicing for the Octave Voyetra. And so I studied with him, you know, basically I interned with him for a while. I interned with him for a while, and then he hired me as a tech. So I learned a crazy amount of stuff from him too. And yeah, so that was like this for me. I guess also I think one of the major things, like I'd been exposed to this guy, David Tudor, who was like John Cage's pianist, but also a composer in his own right. And I saw him actually at Bard right shortly before he died. And there was this idea he had of like the score is the circuit. That like there is this relationship between like constructing electronic tools and composing. Okay. And so that just like spoke to me, like that idea. And it was like sort of like a lot of things connected through that node.
That they're one and the same?
Yeah. Okay. And that for me, like that could be like building a synth was still working on my music. You know, it wasn't like I was a tech. I mean, I had a job as a tech, but actually like this was part of my compositional process that I was
Now, had you been looking at it as two separate things?
I think it's sort of just like society would say those are two separate things. And for me, because I came to it like through him, it just didn't ever seem like that. Okay. You know, like it just was like, I mean, I could, you know, I could tell, oh, I'm here at my job, like fixing a memory book. I'm not composing right now, but like, you know, but that was, you know, that's how I worked on music for a while, was building circuits and designing things that helped me to make the kind of music that I wanted to make in the way that I did. And, around that time. So I, you know, in New York, I met Delia Gonzalez, who's an artist and a musician, and we started collaborating and working on a project together, working on a music project together. And we had done a lot of collaborations before. We did, you know, a lot of performance art collaborations and different music collaborations. And then at the time that I was finishing some synths and some circuits, we started to work with these synths that I was making. And quite often, like, there would be some synthesizer music that would be part of a performance art show or films. And so I think we, you know, it was, in a way, it was like we were almost I wouldn't say we weren't aware that we were making music. It was really clear we were making music, but we were not sure what it was. Like, you know, I wasn't sure what it was. Also, I was working on lots of other stuff, you know, like I was working on lots of other projects, music projects and art projects at the time. And then, you know, and then this, you know, it's just one of the crazy things that happens in life. Like, I was looking for work doing synth tech stuff, and I sent out an email to about I don't know how many people, tons of people. And James Murphy was the only one that wrote back and was like, "Oh my God, we have this studio full of gear we bought on eBay, and none of it works right. You know, and we've been using all of it, and we love the sounds, but if you could stabilize it, you know, that'd be great." So that became my job. You know, it's like the studio tech in the DFA studio. And
at what point is this of LCD?
So this is right at the beginning.
Okay.
Like, actually, the first thing I think that happened when James hired me was he was like, there's this song, and I just made this song with my band, and you know, it was kind of like a, you know, it was just a thing. I just put out this record. I wrote it, and I wrote it kind of quick, and you know, it's like this, you know, I felt like it was like a cool, like a statement, but it seems to be kind of catching on, and because it's catching on, I might have to play it live.
Okay,
and it's all built around a Casio drum beat that was like made on this like half broken boombox thing. So like, do you think you could build like a super Casio that would be like a sturdy roadworthy thing? And the song was Losing My Edge, and you know, like we all know the story of that, you know, like that, you know, but it was sort of before it became popular, and actually we never ended up making the super Casio. I worked on it for a long time, but it just never came to fruition. But that was like the really beginnings of LCD Sound System. And I would do a fair amount of stuff like for him, for the band, just in terms of like some gear stuff, like, you know, doing some mods in the studio or building stuff for the studio, or also like, you know, getting gear in shape to take it on tour. And you know, and in that time, sort of like the folks from DFA, I don't think James actually came because I think he was already on tour with LCD. I think it was like the first LCD tour, like came and saw some of the music that I was working on with Delia, and they were like, "Oh, we'd love to put this out."
Okay.
And so then it sort of was like, that was sort of the beginning of this idea that, like, you know, every once in a while James would be like, "Oh, you know, like we really want to play, I can't remember, maybe it's like Beat Connection or something. We want to play with this song that has this big synth part in it, and like nobody else can play it. Like we would love it if like we could figure out how to get you like to just be a guest in the band." And then it sort of just never, like, for whatever reason, just like didn't happen until many years later. You know, in like 2008, I guess I played like a DFA party in London, and James was like, you know, we're gonna make one last record, and I can finally do the thing, and I really want to have you do the synth stuff in the band. And so then I sort of moved from being like a behind the scenes person to being in the band. And then now the band got back together. Now that, you know. Yeah.
So how did you become the drummer, and you're still programming all the synths
for LCD?
Yeah.
Well, I'm only a drummer and like a little like when I do little percussion things.
Okay, but, so you just do that one part, and then but otherwise you're like
I have this like synthesizer world, and I don't know. I think you know, before that, I think they were sort of like not playing some songs because they had synth parts that they couldn't play live, and you know, other times they were sort of like making, you know, doing stuff that like, you know, that I think James no longer wanted to do. Like he wanted to really have the synth stuff really fleshed out. Okay. So like, I mean, the first thing that I did was kind of like basically like design some systems mostly based around like newer Eurorack modules. To sort of take, because in the studio, like, you know, he's using a very wide variety of vintage instruments, and we needed to create something that could sort of like very authentically create those kinds of sounds, but like that wouldn't break if we took it on tour, and that would, you know, like maybe have like 3 or 4 systems instead of like 12 systems,
Okay.
which is what I was using in the studio. So the first thing I did was sort of like try to design those systems and then learn how to play the songs on them. And and that's, that's what eventually happened in like 2010. I was living in Berlin and I moved back to New York to start working with LCD. And we just went into production, and that was, my job since.
And how do you find out when that's your last album? It's going to be the tour. Like, how do you find that out?
You mean with back in 2011?
The original.
I knew it going in. I mean, that was very clear. Like,
that it was just going to be.
Yeah. He, at that time, he said, "Look, I want to make just one final album, and we're going to do a tour, and then it's done, and I'm going to go and do other stuff."
Okay.
And so, I mean, from even before, I mean, I think that I got the invitation in like October of 2008, and rehearsals started in like February of 2010. So for a year, I already knew, like, this is just a temporary thing. And, I was quite surprised to find out that it made sense too. I was like, oh, well, it makes sense. Like, you want to keep making music. You already have a group of people that you are comfortable making music with. Like, I can see why you would want to move on and do something else, but I can also see why you would want to come back and do that.
Yeah.
Because it's like, well, wait, I was going to not do LCD Sound System, but it wasn't like I was going to not make music ever again. And so, I was surprised. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised. And
what was the experience of the final shows? And I guess I should
great.
put final in quotes.
Well, that brings me back to what we were talking about in the very beginning. Like, I mean, particularly, Madison Square Garden was amazing because it was just an amazing event. And it was a celebration. And I think also for James, it was kind of a big victory to be like, like my like ragtag band is like playing at Madison Square Garden. And because I think he has a real strong ethos too about the music that he makes. It's sort of like, it's a real victory. Yeah. And it was a great social event, and certainly I'd never been to Madison Square Garden. It was like, pretty cool. Okay. And like every time I walked out Madison Square Garden, I was there. But the Terminal 5 shows, those lead up shows that sort of got added when the scalpers went crazy on the MSG tickets, those were just unbelievable. Just in terms of that, what I was talking about is that we had been playing for a year and a half almost every night. Yeah. And then in that space of having really developed a really strong connection as players, we learned a lot of this like more epic, like we learned all the 45-33 stuff. We learned a lot of this like more epic music, and that's just very cool. Yeah. Like, it's very cool to be totally tuned in as players, be like very like kind of top of your game in terms of playing and listening and tuning in. There are lots of things that we sort of like wrote on the spot in between songs at a certain point in the tour. And then to be like, oh, we're going to now take on some new music. So it's very cool. And those Terminal Spot, for like, especially the last two Terminal 5 shows, it was just like, they were long. They were like 3-hour shows. Of course, the audience was very like just enthusiastic and attentive, and knew they were sort of experiencing something very special.
Does it not feel long because of the adrenaline? Yeah, the moment you're in the moment for those 3 hours.
It's very just like like very very like tense, but in a good way. Just like a very sustained time of like paying attention. Like even in a 2-hour movie, I'll probably tune out for a while. Yeah. But like that was like very sustained attention for a long period of time, and just a real experience of like playing with other people in a very connected way. Okay. And those just were astounding. Those were astounding. Like, those were astounding shows.
And do you feel the relief of not having the pressure that you're a part of this big project, but it's not yours?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's categorically different when I make my own music, when I play my own music, for sure. I mean, both are anxiety-provoking in certain ways. Like, especially, I think, in LCD, there's like several lines I play that are sort of like iconic in a way or something. Like it's like there'll be a drum beat, and if you know the drum beat, then you know it. But a lot of times it's like I'll bring in the part where it's like, oh, that's what the song is. So I'm like, I hope I play it, I hope I don't mess it up,
like the whole,
which I have. Like it's a relief once you do it once. It's like okay. And with my own music, it's just very different. It's harder to describe what the anxiety is. But it's just that's the thing about being a creative person, that it is actually scary to just sort of like put your art out there. And and like for me, it's great to do both. Like it's really, really great to do both. I certainly learn a lot from like working with James, and then I have my own things that that you sort of need to move through me. I feel like that's how I look at it.
Which I want to talk to you about.
Yeah.
But just how do you find out about the reunion? Like how was?
I mean, I just got a call. Our James said, "Hey, I would love to have you over for coffee and talk to you about a couple things."
And you didn't know what that was going to be.
I didn't. I had no idea. It was. I think I was one of the later people to know. Possibly, I don't know actually. And so, I went over to James' house for coffee, and he was like, so, we're gonna put the band back together, and we're gonna make new music. We're gonna make a new record. And he played me some stuff, and I liked it a lot, and I was like, okay, I'm in.
Yeah, you've been working on the new stuff, or
a bit, a bit. I think it's tough to record and be on tour at the same time. But I think he's been making some progress. I've done some work in the studio on it too, and like I don't know what state it is in right now, but
and that's supposed to be next year.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's exciting, dude.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
So now you've got your Black Meteoric Star.
Yeah.
Music. Talk about that. The new project. What's the album called?
This one is called The Second Coming.
Okay. And this is the last record?
Well, I don't know. That came out in the press. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't 100% know where that came from. I mean, I'll answer that question by way of a bit of history. So, like, I started Black Meteoric Star in 2006. Pretty much, it came out of like, sort of like the end of my collaboration with Delia Gonzalez and trying to figure out, well, like what do I want to do as a solo? Like, not even what do I want to do as a solo artist, because actually at the time I started Black Meteoric Star, I thought we would keep collaborating, but it was just a sort of a downshift. Like, our lives had changed and our situations had changed, and I'd moved to Berlin, and it was sort of like, okay, well, I want to cultivate another part of my creativity. That's a better way to describe it. And I was really loving going to dance clubs, and I wanted to make dance music, and I was inspired. I think it's the best way to say it. I was really inspired just to make that music, and I had no idea what it was going to turn into at the time. What I thought is that I was going to start DJing more. Like, I'd kind of DJed a lot when I was like a kid, like a teenager, but I hadn't really done it for a while. And I kind of thought I was gonna start DJing more, and I was sort of like, well, I'd like to make tracks to play when I DJ, and so that's kind of what I was doing. And then it's sort of and then the collaboration between Delia and I sort of really ended, and I started thinking like, oh, what do I want to do with this? And at the time I was still very connected to like DFA, so I was talking to them about it, and they expressed some interest in like putting out a record of that music. So I initially thought, I'll put a couple 12 inches out. I mean, if I want to DJ them, how better? That would be cooler to have them on vinyl than have them on CDs at the time. That's what it would have been. But I didn't think there would be like a live thing so much. I thought, well, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking just like, just put out some tracks for a while. And then actually, then James contacted me and said, oh, we're doing a big DFA party in London, and we want to have you play the new stuff. And I wasn't going to really do it live, but sounds cool. And I'm not doing a live thing right now. So then I started, and then stuff started to form. Like I started to think, oh, okay, well, this is like, what do I really want to do? Like I could put out a couple 12 inches, but like maybe this is more. And then I made some more tracks, and then I came up with a name, and then it started to, and then what happened was it started to develop this like identity, like that project sort of started to develop like this identity of its own. And it's like Black Meteoric Star kind of became a character.
Okay.
And it became it became a sort of expression of a certain part of my like creative sensibility. And
what's that? Or
which part is it?
Yeah, or what is the character?
It's hard to get my head around. I mean, you kind of just have to see it. Like it's like a dark, strange person. I mean, I think it's just the music, it's like it was sort of like the character that of the music evoked for me. And it's also like my idea, like when I was like 5 years old, of like what's cool. I think that's a lot of it. It was like just like a very, very in a way, like, or maybe teenage, but like a much younger idea of just like what's cool. Like, sort of harkening back to the stuff we were talking initially of like a time when there was sort of like a very defined counterculture and like my observations of that, and sort of like, like there are lots of like punk, like there's a lot of punks mixed in with there and stuff. But yeah, so then it started developing this thing, and I started to play it live, and I started to also like create like costumes for when I played live, and sort of create like an identity of this character. And then I did that for a while. Like Black Meteoric Star has actually only ever played in the US like 4 times, and they've all been in New York. I think that will change now with the new record, but I played a lot in Europe. I toured for like a year and a half on that record in Europe, played a lot of shows. And at the time I felt like it was a temporary thing. Like I thought it was a sort of like, in a way, like a phase that I was moving through creatively, that I was going to do this project for a while, that it was sort of, in a way for me creatively, a counterpoint to the Days of Mars record, to say like, this is one part of my creative sensibility, the part that was brought out by this collaboration. Here's another part of my creative sensibility. And then I'm going to move on. Like, then it was like Crystal Arc. Here's another part, like, that I was laying out. I felt like that was the sort of like, sort of first wave of my, like, whatever, like professional recording career, was I'm going to lay out these different themes. Like, here's one theme of like something I'm interested. Here's one theme of something I'm interested. Here's one thing I'm interested.
And later, the end of that chapter.
Yeah, and that later I'll, like, I'm very, I'm like a very slow person. Like so that I think was my approach. Like, I'm going to lay out these different themes, and then those are going to be the themes that I work with for the next 10 or 15 years. Interweaving them and combining them and stuff. So Black Meteoric Star felt like a temporary project, and then. But I also wasn't. So I decided I wasn't going to do it live anymore. Yeah. Also, I started to focus on the Crystal Arc, and that was a very big live show to put on, and it would have been very difficult to do those two things at the same time. But I was always kind of like making Black Meteoric Star tracks on the side. I mean, one of the things that defines those tracks is that they're all recorded live, so there's no like multi-tracking or overdubbing. It's just what I can do in a live take, and they're all recorded at cassette, so they have a sort of a particular sound. And they usually, like, I'll usually sort of like have a set of equipment, like I'm just going to use this equipment. But I sort of was like on the side of like still like making a lot of Black Meteoric Star tracks. And well, on the subject of tracks, who runs the label Nation out of Chicago, and I met in Berlin like right when that first Black Meteoric Star record was coming out, and I gave him a copy of it, and he really liked it. And he gave me a bunch of his records, and I also really liked it. Just felt like this, like, oh wow, we're on the same page, even though we have only, met each other now. And he was like, if you ever do any more Black Meteoric stuff, like, I want to put it out. I'm just saying, like, no pressure, but if you ever do it, like, I really wanted it. And I thought, well, actually, it really makes sense. Like, it's a really good fit for a label, and like, I mean, it's a good fit for me. The label is a good fit for me. So then something just clicked, like, again, I guess it was a thing of like maybe one project phasing out a little bit. Like, we made the Crystal Arc record and put it out, and we toured on that. And then, and then I started doing solo releases, but there was this thing where Black Meteoric Star just sort of like bubbled back up.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, hey, you I thought we'd kind of finished with this. And so it was one of those things like inner and outer were connecting. I think at that time, like Trax was also like, I'm just saying, if you could give me a Black Meteoric Star record this year, I would be psyched. It's up to you, whatever you want to do. But.
So you have a goal.
Yeah, it was like two things. Like I felt that energy started to burble up again, and also like externally, it was like welcomed, And so I started to work on the record, and I made a lot of tracks. Like I made a ton of tracks, and because they're sort of like, because they're recorded live and they're in a sense kind of loose, like it's not like a thing where like, I was sending tracks back and forth to the label, and it's not like a thing where it's like, oh, well, like, what if we adjusted the mix on this? It's like, that's what it is.
Yeah.
That track's what it is. Like, we're just making other tracks. So I was like, made tons of tracks, and eventually, we had a great dialogue back and forth of like, which ones should be on the record. Sort of like he would say some stuff, I would say some stuff, and finally I submitted what I felt was like very strong, and he really liked it, and so that became the record, and it's like 8 tracks, and it's an album. The original Black Meteoric Star releases were really like, it was more really a collection of 12 inches. It was like the tracks were very long. It was 3, in a sense maybe it was like a 3 by LP, but it was really like, it was really like 3 12 inches. And it was interesting. I mean, there was a very specific choice to make it in that format because it's like, in a way, like almost like a dance music album.
Okay.
Sort of like a newer idea about an album. Like narratively connected 12 inches. But when I approached this, I was like, I really want to make an album.
Yeah.
Like I want to make a Black Meteoric Star album that's like a cohesive whole and like in a sense, like a very traditional album format. And so it was different, there's some long tracks, but some of the tracks are shorter, and like it's also very narrative, but in a different way, I think.
And it's epic. It's what, like 2 albums, double
it's
album, right?
two pieces of wax. Yeah, it's 8 tracks. It's kind of epic.
Yeah. Are you thinking of for club and at home for this?
Yeah,
okay,
definitely. I think it's like I mean, I think that all of the tracks like definitely stand up to dance floor play, both in how they're composed and how they're produced. I mean, those things obviously are they're connected, but I think it's a listening experience too. Like as an album, I mean, I think the dance music album, I think it's like it's a work in progress or something. Like I think lots of people have made really great dance music albums, but it's like I think it's a thing that's still coming into its own in a lot of ways.
And that'll be sometime this year.
I hope so. Yeah, I basically the German, like a game out of the German Rights Collection Society has like over the past few years has been very much becoming a lot more aggressive in the way it collects, and recently has like asked a lot of the smaller pressing plants, probably the bigger ones too, but I don't know anything about big pressing plants, to sort of like turn over all of their, not their records, like vinyl records, but their financial records. And that has slowed down.
Okay.
Like significantly slowed down. So it was supposed to be out, but the pressing's been slowed down. Okay. I have the test pressing. Sounds great.
And I'm going to hear it. I'm excited to hear it. So eventually soon, hopefully. Yeah. Cool. So we're a good place for people to keep in touch online to find out when it's going to come out?
Yeah. So I am on all the networks. I have a Facebook page for music and Instagram account and Twitter, although I haven't used Twitter very much lately. And also SoundCloud. Also Nation has a Facebook page.
Just under your name?
Yeah, it's been actually it's like been available for pre-order for a while because we thought it was going to be out a bit ago. So Rush Hour is doing the distribution, and people can pre-order it from there.
And it's Russom?
It's
Russom.
My last name? Russom.
Russom, yeah. Okay. I was right the first time. Okay, so They just Google Gavin Russom.
Yeah, you can Google Gavin Russom. I have a Wikipedia page. And you can write to me. I also have published my email address in articles because sometimes I can go on for a long time and sometimes I just have to cut it short and be if you want to know any more about this, just email me.
Okay. Well, this was wonderful, Gavin.
Thanks so much.
This is the definitive Gavin Russom story.
I'm
going to call it that.
Yeah.
I'm putting it out there. This is excellent. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Sure.
Take off your shoes. Take off your clothes. Wade out into the lake and look at the landscape. Climb into the tree. Leave the scene of the crime. Die to your old self. And look at the landscape. Let go of your ridiculous old ideas. Shut the fuck up. Go hard or go home. And look at the landscape. Do not bring peace. Bring a sword. Rearrange the paint on your face before I rearrange your face. And look at the landscape. Look at the landscape. Look at the landscape. Look at the landscape. Ha! Look at the landscape. Look at the landscape. Ha! Look at the landscape. Ha! Look at the landscape. Ha! Look at the landscape. Look at the landscape. Ha! Look at the landscape. 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 Ah! Look at the landscape. Look at the landscape. What the fuck are we doing? Look at the landscape. Look at the landscape. Unknown. Unknown secret places. Buried deep beneath the shelled landscape.
And that was Black Meteoric Star, the project of Gavin Russom, Shelled Landscape. Go to his website, gavinrussom.com, RUSSOM. Social media links are there, and of course, the email address for him. I am online several places, several ways. TalkMusicTalk.com for more information on the podcast. My personal website, which is thisisboice.com, where you can read excerpts from my books. They are novels, and check out the music that I make. And if you are on Twitter or Instagram, follow me there at thisisboice. Don't forget your call to action. Please share this episode on social media if you enjoyed it. It helps spread the word. Also, take the survey, talkmusictalk.com/survey. And finally, download the app wherever you get your apps. It is free for iPhone and Android, or you can subscribe to the podcast on Google Play or iTunes. Whatever you do, please leave a rating and or review in the store. And a good reason to do it is because you can get episode 107 with Ryan Leese. It is out now for you to enjoy. Thank you so much for listening to this episode with Gavin Russom. Hope you enjoyed it. Till next time, and there will be a next time. This one's for you, Liz.